The Supreme Court can dismantle the censorship industrial complex. This headline and this article was surprisingly good, and it came from the Hill. I was absolutely surprised, and I'm going to read a snippet from it and get everybody's to chime in. But let's watch this again for the sake of editing and putting this clip together. We're going to watch this 3-minute clip again. As we watch it, gentlemen, if we can pay close attention to what Justice Brown says about her anti-constitutional point of view, and then also at the very end, what the anchor says about whether or not regular press like the New York Times and Washington Post, whether our government treats them like subordinates, like the social media platforms. And he says, "You're damn right." So those are the two things I want all of us to kind of zero in on, and whatever else you want to comment on. But let's watch it all the way through, 3 minutes.
The Supreme Court is weighing the interaction between government and social media in a landmark free speech case. The case stems from the Biden administration's early efforts to push platforms to take down content it deemed misinformation about COVID and the 2020 election.
Justice Jackson?
So my biggest concern is that your view has the First Amendment hamstringing the government in significant ways in the most important time periods. I mean, what would you have the government do? I've heard you say a couple times that the government can post its own speech, but in my hypothetical, kids, this is not safe, don't do it, is not going to get it done. And so I guess some might say that the government actually has a duty to take steps to protect the citizens of this country.
Well, first of all, that clip by Ketanji Brown Jackson, that was kind of terrifying because the entire purpose of the First Amendment is to restrain the government. It's not to restrain the public from getting in the way of government action. It's the opposite. If it restrains the government, that's a good thing. That's sort of the idea behind the statute. In this instance, the reason this suit is being filed is because the plaintiffs in this case, in particular, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff and Dr. Aaron Hariati, they had their speech suppressed because they were contradicting a false government official opinion. And this is the entire purpose of the First Amendment, is to prevent the government from creating a hegemonic opinion that cannot be challenged. That is why we have a free press. And that was the essence of this case. And the government was allowed to argue the opposite.
Conservative Justice Samuel Alito, on the other hand, had this to say.
I cannot imagine federal officials taking that approach to the print media, our representatives over there. If you did that to them, what do you think the reaction would be? And so I thought, the only reason why this is taking place is because the federal government has got Section 230 and antitrust in its pocket.
Let's listen to what Justice Alito said, and then I'll ask you about it.
When they're unhappy, they curse them out. There are regular meetings. There is constant pestering of Facebook and some of the other platforms. So it's treating Facebook and these other platforms like they're subordinates. Would you do that to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Associated Press or any other big newspaper or wire service?
As someone who's covered a White House, the answer to that, Mr. Justice, is yes. They would do that, and they would do it often.
Wow. And the chuckle gentleman was like Nick saying "sweet summer child." That was basically his "you sweet summer child." Of course, Justice Alito. But whoever wants to go first, that was astonishing to me. That clip when he said, "Of course they treat regular press like subordinate," but it explains so much. Whoever wants to take that.
Well, let's go ahead and let's talk about how the press has been pushed around by politicians and those in power. There's the war in Iraq, where there was the narrative of, if you don't support this invasion of us removing Saddam Hussein, we are going to say that you're a traitor. How many of the anti-war critics lost their jobs, at least during that time, when there was still trust in the media, when there was some supposed or the idea of trust in the media. How many people lost their jobs? How many times have we seen, even before then, before the Telecoms Act was signed by Bill Clinton, even before then, when politicians would push everything they had to silence an article coming out from the New York Times. It has happened before, over and over again. It's just, I don't think people have talked about it as much as they should, because all the tensions right now on social media, and we use our cell phones and our computers all the time. But the media now is intertwined with our politicians, because the same people who donate to Democrats and Republicans are also on the board of directors or by proxy associated with the corporations that control MSNBC, CNN, ABC, CBS, New York Times, Fox News. I mean, it's all connected in there. So if a story is going to come out, they're going to get a phone call. I'll never forget when Project Veritas showed that story of ABC, when they could have revealed the story about first name Jeffrey, last name E, and they were so upset about it. But they got a phone call. They don't release that story. And apparently they had everything. And that lady from ABC was saying, we had interviews, we had evidence, everything. And the reason why they couldn't do it is because they wanted to speak to Will and Kate of the royal family. Last I checked, didn't we have a goddamn revolution in this country to dispose all monarchs? Like, you're supposed to tell the truth. And she was upset, like we couldn't tell the story. Well, lady, you sat on that story. So yes, politicians, those in power, have pushed their influence and whatever push and pull they have on the media before. And this isn't anything new, but I'm rather frightened about this, because I said that there's going to be a moment when independent media might just be removed as a whole. Like, no matter what we say or how many times we appeal, like, we'll be gone. And this, I don't want to say this is the beginning, but it sure feels like it. And I'm having a chill on the back of my neck.
What about you guys? What do you think?
Ketanji Brown, and I'll pass it right to you, King. I know you want to chime in. Ketanji Brown Jackson is a Supreme Court justice, but she's a fucking child. The thing, remember this, guys, because I'm going through my villain arc where I'm really looking at every single person, and they're like with titles, credentials, the esteemed establishment, and I'm realizing like all these people are morons. So she's
They're
like,
not serious people. They're not serious people at all. None of them.
Some people will say they are deeply unserious, in fact. So she says, don't the government, shouldn't they have the right to protect us? So that's why they should have the right to censor us. The Supreme Court literally said, and once again, you're a Supreme Court justice, so you should know this. The Supreme Court literally said the police don't have any duty to protect us at all. So the police don't have a duty to protect us. But Ketanji Brown Jackson is trying to present an argument that the government has the right to censor us to protect us. You know how ridiculous that sounds to me at face value? Anyone who believes the government is doing anything, the government is expanding its power to protect you, and you believe them, you are a child. And that's what people like Ketanji, though, that is what that style of liberal generally believe. But King,
well, before we bring in Nick, first of all, I got to push back, and this causes us to have a fallout. But Jank and Anna say the government doesn't do bad things, so
they used to.
They used to do bad things. Okay, they don't do it not anymore. So Nick, be quiet. You are abusing violence and you're smearing the poor government.
Yeah, not since the church committee.
Violence is never okay, except when the government does it. It's just perfect.
Go ahead, Keaton.
Go ahead, Keaton.
I was just going to say, this ruling didn't surprise me all that much. I mean, what Jackson said there, that is shocking, just because of how absolutely ass backwards it is. The whole point of the First Amendment is to hamstring the government. That's literally why it exists. In a theoretical nice world, in a nice country where the government can go to Facebook and say, hey, would you mind putting in place rules that say that you can't say certain things about viruses or whatever, and Facebook were free to say, no, we're not going to do that, but thanks anyway for asking. Okay, thanks for taking my call, bye-bye. Like, that is the world in which this ruling makes sense. It is a theoretical world, right? In reality, there's obvious coercive power behind every government interaction with anybody, much less these social media companies who, one by one, their CEOs have already been dragged into Congress and grilled and interrogated for hours. The Twitter files leaks show coercion going far beyond that. And so, look, I understand like the theoretical framework and logic behind this ruling, but it shows absolutely no awareness of recent history up until this very moment and going back far beyond the Iraq war. But Kit, that's a great point. I mean, look at how the media was really strong-armed into parroting this just transparently nonsense narrative in the run-up to what was just so obviously a war of choice.
Right. Real quick, and I just want to add this in here, but there was that story when Watergate was happening, and the Nixon administration was furious at the reporters that were breaking the story, and they were demanding that they get fired and censored and silenced. And their editor at the time was saying, "No, I'm going to fight for these guys. You won't get that now." And we can thank Bill Clinton for creating that environment. Take it away, Russ.
Well, see, I think that's part of what's going on here in terms of would they treat reporters like that? They don't have to anymore. They broke them. They broke them a long time ago. They completely corporatized those news divisions. They have that chummy, friendly relationship where those threats are not necessary. The press has become courtiers to the powerful now. When you look at those interactions in the Twitter file, I think part of what you're seeing is Silicon Valley is a new power base, and they're inclined towards libertarianism in their governing philosophies. And they are not from the traditional East Coast power bases that the legacy media and the government both come out of, the skull and bones people. They're not really coming out of that. They're coming out of a whole different ecosystem of wealth with a very different philosophy. And I think a lot of what you see going on with the guy with whatever you think about his tactics, the best name in the FBI, Elvis Chang. What you see Elvis Chang doing is basically trying to get them to submit in the way that the legacy media has. He's really running an op on them, trying to develop this, hey, we're all on the same team, right? They pulled this off with the corporate media decades ago. And it seems like that's what they were trying to do with them. But a point that Glenn Greenwald was making in his video about this is the press has certain established constitutional protections and legal protections. Now, sure, you look at what they're doing to Julian Assange, and you can see where the limit of those protections are. But nonetheless, there are some legal grounds to challenge the government interfering with what you're doing in that way. Whereas these tech companies have to live in fear that they're going to pull, I think the statute is 230. The statute
all the time
that allows them not to be held liable for what appears on their platforms. They're constantly dealing with that threat because there is no record of Supreme Court rulings for them to come back with and say, we don't have to do what you say. They can say that, and then they get dragged in front of Congress and threatened. So as Keaton says, sure, in an ideal world where they deal with them the way Glenn describes them dealing with The Intercept, could you not publish that and this is why, and then they could decide? Fine, but that's not the real world. Like, clearly, that's why I said, as soon as I saw this, I said, did they read the Twitter files there? That had to have been part of the evidence here. So how could Jackson even say something like that? Clearly,
I had the
government
same
was
reaction
threatening and coercing them. Yeah, go ahead, CJ.
I had the same reaction. Like, how can you read the Twitter files or the reporting on the Twitter files and not say that is coercive? Like, you can, I mean, imagine like any authority figure making any suggestion. You get what I'm saying? Like, from a police officer, you think a police officer say, I think it's a good idea if you go over there. You think that's a suggestion? You get what I'm saying? Like, do you think when a person who has the power to take away your protection of 230?
230.
And yeah, and that person says, hey, we think this is a bad idea over here. That is cool. Like, just the you being in a subordinate position makes it
Of course.
coercive to me. But let's go back to this headline, and I'm going to read some of this and get your comment. The Supreme Court can dismantle the censorship industrial complex. When I saw that headline, I was like, wow, that's interesting. I wonder if the writing will be just as good as the headline. And actually, I was surprised that it was. I don't know who this person is, Hermet Dillion, but it's a pretty decent article. I took a snippet out of it. I'll read a little bit and get your comment. When the government coerces private actors such as Twitter or X to regulate speech that it cannot constitutionally regulate. Think about that. They're asking Twitter to regulate speech that the government can't constitutionally regulate itself.
Right.
Like the government can't go out and say, hey, you on the street, stop saying that. You get what I'm saying? But they're asking a platform to do that. And the article goes on to say those private actors are no longer acting on their own private volition. They have become joint venturers of the government. This joint actor scheme to circumvent the Constitution should be subject to scrutiny under the First Amendment, just as the government itself would be if it were censoring speech directly without using a heavily regulated agent. What do you think of this concept that this first paragraph is talking about? Like the government is censoring you, but by way through a different entity, so you can't come to them and say the government's doing it. Like, what do you guys think of that concept, or any other part that you wanted to comment on this first paragraph here?
Well, this is the whole reason they were able to get away with this, is because they suggest to a private company that they change their rules, their terms of service, and therefore it's not technically government censorship, right? And to your earlier point, CJ, like, yeah, obviously the Twitter files demonstrated in plain sight coercion. Now, what they might say is that, yes, that example of the government leaning on Twitter was coercion, but they might argue that doesn't mean that all government interaction with all social media companies is coercive by definition, right? They might say, but because, like, basically what this ruling does is it kicks it back to the executive and the legislative branch, which in a functioning democracy means they're kicking it back to the voters. Basically, they're throwing it back to we, the people, who look at this and say, okay, if Biden's FBI is coercing social media companies, then somebody has to run and somebody has to win. And whoever that person is has to put in place an FBI that's not going to coerce social media companies. Like that is in theory what they are saying. You may be able to point to certain instances where, yes, it's coercion, plain and simple. What the court here argued, and I think wrongly, especially given all this recent history, is that all interaction is not coercive in nature immediately. And I think given, the events of the past several decades, it's just not possible to make that argument in any kind of real world context. Like, yeah, you can make it in a civics classroom at a university, but this is a physical world that we live in. And the court is, I think, supposed to take that into account when they are making these rulings. And this court clearly did not.
I thought it was very shocking to me to hear. Think about where we are as a society and tell me this is not a collapsing empire when the final judges, the final people that have judgment, who are supposed to interpret the Constitution, says that the Constitution hamstrings the government, that the Constitution gives power. That is just insane. But it took the Negro servant, I must say, to say that most ridiculous bullshit. But go ahead, kid.
Well, I mean, we've seen this before, and we've seen it to happen in previous empires and nations and republics. This is a dying empire, and what they want to do is not have the people talk about, hey, we're living in a dying empire. They don't want to say, hey, our politicians aren't representing us anymore. And we all know about it. I've been speaking to so many people across the political spectrum, and universally, we all are coming down to the same conclusion. The country is dying. It is sick. And there are the people in power don't want us to unite. They don't want us to talk about it. And when we have platforms like YouTube and Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, stuff that we've used a lot that are the number one social media platforms, they want to close that down. But then look at what happens to platforms that do challenge that authority, like Rumble or Odyssey. They're told to be, well, wait, we're going to start holding you back. They're going to start taking you to court. Look at what they did to Rumble in Brazil and in Britain as well, because they didn't like what was being platformed on those different platforms. And each government is wanting to do whatever they want to do to control the people because they don't want people speaking out against authority. And here in America, we have our First Amendment right to speak out. And that was purposely put in place so that we can hold our government accountable. But right now, since we have corporations controlling it and owning our politicians, they want to take that last aspect of freedom, the voice of the people, away. And as soon as they do that, they have the control and power to start removing every single one of us and censoring it. And each of us on this platform, each of us on this show right now, RBN, Do Dissidents, Hardlands Media, we have dealt with the jackboot of not only the YouTube censorship, but censorship and suppression and shadow banning on all the platforms that we use to communicate with our audience. And our audience, too, I still get messages from people saying, hey, how come I can't comment on your video? Or, hey, I'm not being notified when you go live. It is ways for which the corporations which control Silicon Valley, but also our politicians, to silence us. And through the Supreme Court ruling, I mean, it just gives them more ammunition to start going all in to remove our voice.
That's a great point. Before Nick and Russell, you chime in, let me just add another paragraph or two for you to also comment in, and we'll go to Nick and Russell. The Supreme Court has an opportunity to resolve this dissidence and protect Americans' freedom and freedom of speech from increasingly dictatorial government actors in state and federal agencies. The justices have an opportunity to stop government censorship masquerading as protecting Americans from vague threats such as misinformation. That protection, or quote unquote protection, has been badly abused by the government actors who are primarily interested in controlling national narratives that boost their own popularity or vilify their political opponent. And whoever was Russell or Nick, if you wanted to just add that part into your commentary, go ahead, sir.
I saw this segment on Laura Ingraham, who I never cover because she's not usually worth covering, but it was maybe like a few weeks ago. Well, she did this odd segment about how social media companies are driving teenage girls to suicide and depression. And I'm wondering, like, why is she doing this segment? Because she cover Republican Party politics, or she'll bash a Democrat. Maybe she may cover some foreign affairs because she's allowed to do that. She covered Trump stuff, but she did a random segment talking about how teenage girls are being bullied on social media. And then at the very end of the segment, her guest that she had to talk about it was like, this is why we need more tougher regulation on these social media companies. And there it is.
Right.
And when I was watching the segment, the premise is absurd. So Laura Ingraham is a hardcore capitalist Republican. She will watch you and your child die without health care, without losing an ounce of sleep. She will watch you and your homeless child freeze, homeless on the streets, without showing any sympathy. In fact, she would probably think you deserve it. But you believe that person really care about the mental health of your teenage daughter? Do people believe that? And this is the emotional angle that they set up. We're here to protect your children. When they go to that one, I know they're desperate. And when it comes to the security versus freedom argument, because people need to understand that what a lot of these issues come to, freedom versus security. Should we give it this freedom so we should have security, right? And people fall on both sides of that spectrum, whether you believe it or not. That's why people are not allowed to have grenades. Even the people who believe, I believe in the right, but most people don't believe in the right to have grenades. Why? we decide to give up the freedom of having the grenades because we feel very insecure with motherfuckers having grenades in their pocket. So we made that trade-off.
All right, when you guys meet up in Chicago, Russell, make sure you get the whole hotel at least 4 or 5 doors down from Nick, just for safety. You know? Just in case anything goes wrong.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nick.
The reason I bring that up because that's one of the few examples I can think of where most people will side on the security over freedom argument. But me personally, I always will favor the freedom over the security. And I think a lot of people favor the security over the freedom more than they willing to admit. That's why we got cop cities building everywhere.
All
But
right.
Russ, I know you want to go ahead, Russ.
All right. So, well, no, I mean, that's actually a good lead into the aspect of this that's kind of interesting to me on what you were just reading. And particularly speaking about it with you all, because I'm sure it doesn't escape you notice that the people who are reasonable on this court on this subject, the people who were dissenting, were the conservatives. They were the arch conservatives on the court. So in regards to what you just said, Nick, that is a philosophy that in this country you are most likely to hear from conservatives who are particularly libertarian inflected. I mean, it's just true. Now we're all. What's up?
To your point, I'll pass it right to you because I want to emphasize your point. Do you guys know that the Biden administration was trying to give the police the right to it would be legal if it passed, but he was trying to give the police the right to seize your gun without due process, and it was brutally struck down by the Supreme Court because they're like, have you guys lost your fucking mind? It's a blatant violation of the Second and Fourth Amendment, and I covered it. It was so long ago. It was like the early days of FHL. Well, I was like, guys, you have the Biden administration that literally trying to push this law, and they was going to use it to target black people. Black people, poor working class people, had the police seize their guns, and it was struck down by the Supreme Court. And I didn't mean to cut you off, Russell. I bring this up only because we have a right-wing Supreme Court that's to save the black people from an expanding police state where the police can randomly seize your guns. There was a Hallmark case where a cop came in and stole all these people's, it was like this black couple's guns, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the right-wing Supreme Court sided with them. That's the Supreme Court that liberals want us to vote Democrats in order to stop. But that Supreme Court
Exactly. And
look who they put. Go ahead, Russell.
Look who they put on that court. Ketanji Brown Jackson, who, you know what? For a Supreme Court justice to be that shallow is shocking. I think that's part of what was so shocking about that statement. But she is exactly the kind of creature that you would expect the liberal class that nominated her to want, because you can tell the way her mind works. I don't think she was making a dishonest argument, meaning I don't think she was reaching. I think she actually believes that, because what's the core assumption there? The government is good, and what the government is doing is right. That's her core assumption. So for her, the negotiation is, where is the limit that you want to place on the government stopping the stupid people from getting bad information, as opposed to what the government is going to give them, which it doesn't even cross her mind might be bad information. Now, Taibbi wrote an article responding to an attack partly on him and Schellenberger. Overall, it was a Times article covering very lamentfully, kind of foreshadowing this case and the lead into this case, how the right wingers are winning in dismantling the war against disinformation, which of course we would call the censorship industrial complex. But for them, it's the war against misinformation. And reading the article, if you're reading it, I think from a perspective that we all share, it's one of those Times articles. Oh, this is terrible. Now they don't even want to interfere with content. And we're all looking at it going, or I'm reading it going, oh, that's great. That's great. So basically, you're telling me we have to empower conservatives. That's what you're telling me in this article, because you're telling me the reason they're backing off now is because people like Jim Jordan are hitting them with 1,000 subpoenas on everything. And so it's making them, well, we don't want to do anything because we don't want to get dragged in front of Jim Jordan. So it puts people like us, who are not only on the left, but post-duopoly, it puts you in a bind, right? So what do you do? Do you support these guys? It's not like they're heroes. It's not like we agree with them on 99% of things, but it has gotten to the point, if you value speech and civil liberties, yes, are you better off with the Republicans? Hypocritical as they might be, as we've seen since October 7th, because a lot of these same people who are supposed to be free speech advocates want kids kicked off college campuses for being pro-Palestine. So let's not forget that. But nonetheless, you look at the Supreme Court case, what are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? I mean, definitely don't tell me I have to vote Democrat for the Supreme Court.
Well, look,
Not doing
ultimately, the judicial branch is designed as a sort of anti-democratic check on the other two branches, which are more
Right.
democratic in nature. That's what the Supreme Court is, right? It is not accountable to the will of the people. They are simply there to interpret the Constitution. And so ultimately, every Supreme Court ruling somewhere in the subtext is, do we take this decision out of the hands of the people, or do we put this matter in the hands of the people? And in this case, they put it back in the people's hands because they didn't step in and say, no, it is unconstitutional for the government to do this. What that means is it's up to us whether we want a government that will choose to do it or choose not to do it, right? That is basically what they are saying here. And so, yes, what Russell said is true. It's up to us to put in place a government that will choose not to use its coercive power to censor speech. Which options are on the table this year? Zero. And that's the rub. Yeah.
It's unfortunate, but let me add this point, because when you couple the Supreme Court possible decision, what it all likelihood is going to be leaning to, which is allowing him to suppress Twitter, combine that with banning TikTok. How is the framing? Trump is the authoritarian fascist. How is it that we want to avoid fascism by voting for Biden, as if fascism censorship is not here now? So all of that, and also this final question: how are young people going to react at the ballot box if Twitter is banned? So if you want to add this in, whoever wants to take that on first, go ahead.
Do you mean
Add
Twitter or
into the
TikTok?
conversation.
TikTok.
I'm
yeah.
sorry,
'Cause
TikTok.
they care more
I keep
about
saying that.
TikTok.
Yes, TikTok. I'm sorry, TikTok. Yes, go ahead.
I mean, we could sit here and speculate. I mean, ideally, I do hope that, you know, there is more of awareness of younger people saying, hey, why is this happening? And maybe look at our platforms through independent media about why this is going on and why they shouldn't put their faith or trust into Biden or the Democrats. But I'm very curious about the voter turnout, because I've been looking at the entire primaries, and for the Democrats, it's been absolutely pathetic. My state, 20% of the population here turned up to vote. In Hawaii, which is a solid blue state, for example, a previous primary, they had like 20,000. There were 20,000 votes for Biden, 22,000 votes for Bernie, or something of that nature. This year, it was almost barely reaching 1,000. So voter turnout's going to be key. And I think in many ways, a lot of young people aren't enthusiastic about Biden. There's this since his 4 years of being in the White House.
That's crazy. That's crazy. They haven't seen the Dark Brandon memes. That hasn't lit them on fire.
It's not going to do it, because also, not to mention, you know, you got a lot of people who follow those larger TikTok platform, and, you know, building a platform on that, you know, people are losing their business. If TikTok is truly like done, you know, a lot of people are going to be angry that they're losing content that they like to consume. And if that's gone, people are going to be upset that you took away their treat.
Right. Well, especially because presumably it's all going to go over to Zuckerberg, and he's going to censor it. He's going to censor it the way he censors Facebook. It's not going to be the same experience.
Yeah, but Zuckerberg even have a good product with Threads? Because that's
not Threads. It would be Instagram. It would be Reels. That would be where the TikTok.
It's going to go to
traffic
Reels,
would go.
exactly.
Yeah. Which, I mean, yeah, Instagram is pretty hot now. You know, the kids all love it from what I hear. But yes, it is a much more censorious platform. Much more censorious. I mean, Facebook, Meta, like, that's the worst. That's the worst of them all.